I think we should get started. My name is Robert May, and I'm the President of the Royal Society, which, as most of you know, is the British and indeed the Commonwealth Academy of Sciences. And it's my pleasure to welcome those of you who are in this crowded and overflowing audience, but more generally, those who have joined us in a global webcast of this lecture. And I'm vividly aware of that because I have received, it was not necessary to tell David Attenborough, but I have received repeated instructions not to turn my back to the camera and not to wander off across the stage, as is my usual habit. We're here to celebrate the Faraday Prize lecture, and David Attenborough needs no introduction, but nonetheless shall have one briefly inflicted upon him. He was born in London, and he was educated at the rather curiously spelt Wiggiston Grammar School, if I got it correctly, in Leicester, and then went to Clare College in Cambridge, where he took an honours degree in natural sciences and began a broadcasting career which has achieved just over its golden anniversary. Began in '52 when he joined the BBC as a trainee. It went on to include the Zoo Quest series of wildlife documentaries, which some of the older members of the viewing and present audience may recall, and then a number of groundbreaking years as controller of BBC Two, and the first of his major comprehensive series, Life on Earth. And that has been succeeded by Sequence, The Living Planet, The Trials of Life, Life in the Freezer, The Private Life of Plants, The Life of Birds, The Life of Mammals, the list goes on. He was knighted in 1985 for his services to broadcasting and given an upgrade to be Companion of Honour in 1996. And he wouldn't get to the podium if I were to go through the recitation of honours and awards. I'm delighted to be able to say he's been a Fellow of the Royal Society for more than 20 years, demonstrating our collective good judgment and wisdom and ecumenical embrace. And I have enormous pleasure. I'm going to give him another medal and a certificate, and then he's going to talk to you. Welcome, David Attenborough.
President, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture is named after a great scientist, and it seems to me almost the first great communicator of science, Michael Faraday. My predecessors have all, I think, been practicing scientists and great popularizers. I am not a practicing scientist. I come from, as it were, the other side of the fence, though maybe I once had pretensions to be a scientist, but I'm not. And so it seemed to me that it might be appropriate for this lecture for me to have a look at the ways in which we, as broadcasters and popularizers, in which we have tried to convey the reality of the natural world. I'm sure it's quite right, as physicists tell us, that the mere act of observation is enough to change the phenomenon. And it is certainly the case that we, as natural history filmmakers, inevitably and perfectly properly transform, and certainly change in many ways, the reality of what it is we try to show. We have no alternative if we are to make it into a form that's visible on television. When I was in the 30s, when I was a boy, I read the classic explorations and travels, and among my most favourite books was one about the Malay archipelago, which today is called Indonesia, which was written by a great scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace. He was, of course, the co-proprietor proposer of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But what pleased me as a boy was that he was the first man ever to see birds of paradise displaying in the wild. And the frontispiece of his second volume looks like this. I thought it was marvellous and exciting and thrilling, and I yearned to see such a sight. And it doesn't seem very long ago, to me at any rate, that this was the only, I was going to say first-hand, but it wasn't actually first-hand because, of course, Wallace didn't draw that. He gave sketches to an artist. That was the only image of this particular courtship display that anybody in the Western world could see. And it seems recent indeed that that was the case. I yearned to go and look at it for myself. And in the 50s, I was lucky enough to get that opportunity. 1955, the cameras we had were run by clockwork. They couldn't take more than 2 minutes, 40 seconds of film at one time. They wouldn't run for longer than 40 seconds. The sound we had was a thing the size of an attaché case, which I carried, with a very primitive microphone and a tape recorder. And there was no way of linking the two. We couldn't film in sync, as the phrase is. So Charles Lagos and I, a cameraman, set off for New Guinea, and it took us about 3 months. I won't go into that, but the climax eventually was that we did indeed at last find a displaying bird. It was quite early in the dawn. There was hardly enough night to film. The film we had was black and white, but Charles was so excited at seeing this bird that he started filming, and his camera, of course, made a noise like a concrete mixer. And so I couldn't record anything, and I kept saying to Charles, give me a chance. And Charles said, wonderful shot. Anyway, I, at last, had a chance to record. Now, the bird called in groups of 2, which I got, 2 groups. Wah, 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 wah. And then it flew away. That's all I had. When I came back, we put together a film, and this is it.
And now a second hen bird arrived. And then suddenly he flexed his wings and started his dance. In a frenzy of excitement, he threw his ruby plumes above his head, shrieking with excitement.
Well, not a brilliant piece of film, but nonetheless, the next few days after that went out, my old professor of zoology wrote to me. I was thrilled, congratulating me on this coup. It was, after all, the first time birds of paradise had been filmed displaying in the wild. And he went on to say, he said, I made a most interesting observation of your film. Your bird called in a group of 7, and then groups of 8. Never 2 7s together, never 2 8s together, never 9, never 7. I think you should write a paper. And of course, I had joined up that tiny bit of film, of tape, and it was simply going round and round and round. All of which, of course, shows that even if you have the best of possible motives, you are inclined to distort reality and put in things that you never intended. The sound, in fact, is one of the big problems that we have in making natural history films. We've got long lenses now. I can take a close-up of a bird sitting at the far end of this hall, head and shoulders, no problem at all. But if the bird is making scratching noises with its feet or perhaps eating, there is no microphone that will give you that in a close-up sound. It will always sound a distance. So, on occasion, we have no alternative but to invent sounds. In the old days, we used to have a whole library of strange discs, and indeed experts who could do extraordinary things at the London Telephone Directory. We used to, for example, if you wanted the noise of a man walking through a swamp, we had a record of a donkey chewing hay, which if you played very, very slowly and faded up and down with the steps, gave exactly that effect. But even now, we have problems. Look at this.
A high slope above the sea ice is a relatively safe position for a bear's maternity den. Large males, who sometimes bother a mother bear, avoid these steeper places. But she is still wary, initially making quite short journeys. At first, a cub will stay within the entrance, watching its mother loosen up her body after the long winter in a cramped den.
Well, I think you'll agree that if that bear made no sound at all when it came out of its den, the film would lose a great deal of its impact. In fact, Hugh Miles and Mike Salisbury, who took that film, were over a quarter of a mile away with a 2,000mm lens to get those marvellous pictures. But there was no way in which any microphone could pick up any sound of that from that distance. So, totally justifiably, it seems to me, they had to improvise that sound. It was not a scientifically accurate observation. It was, in fact, put it coarsely, custard powder in a silk stocking, which you squeeze in certain ways and gives you that rather splendid sound. Well, I have no difficulty with that. That seems to me perfectly appropriate and all right. But later on in the same film, no, it was in a different film about polar bears, they had another problem. Polar bears, as you've just seen, the mothers hibernate in caves under the snow during the winter. At least they go to sleep there and they give birth there. And the fact that the baby, which is a tiny little cub, the fact that the baby is born in those circumstances is one of the key elements in the natural history and the life cycle of the polar bear. And in a later film, this is how it was shown.
The northern lights play in the winter sky, whilst below in the mountains, and by now well covered by a deep layer of snow, this pregnant female settles down for the next 4 months. Is born helpless and blind after only 60 days in the womb. Deep under the protective covering of snow and tucked into its mother's thick fur, the cub stays warm despite the appalling conditions of winter outside where temperatures drop to below minus 50 degrees.
To have tried to get a camera into the maternity den of a polar bear would have endangered not only the life of the cameraman, it might well have endangered the life of the cub. Yet this was an important episode. How to show it? Well, those pictures were taken in a zoo. And I have no difficulties with that either. It seems to me that if you are concerned with showing as best you can and in most detail that you can the life cycle of a polar bear, that's perfectly acceptable. If you had said, I was an intrepid Arctic explorer and I happened to come across a bear in a maternity den and this is what I saw, that would be a falsehood. I have some inhibitions now about one or two words in the commentary, which I think I might perhaps have changed, which were a bit too precise, perhaps. But I don't disapprove of including those films, and we, in view of our worries about it, made it perfectly clear in the publicity which went out at the same time as the programme that those included sequences shot in a zoo. It may be that now, and as our techniques improve, there would be ways of doing that in the wild, because our techniques of filming animals have increased beyond measure in the last few decades. Now, for example, we have electronic cameras the size of my little finger, which you can put in all kinds of places, and indeed, actually, on animals. What about this?
The cameras are so light, Tilly can easily carry two, giving a perfect panoramic view of the ultimate soaring machine. She can use the mountain updrafts to glide effortlessly for hours on end. And her wings form a stable hunting platform as she scans the ground for food. Our cameras don't get in her way at all. Technology like this is allowing scientists to observe animals at a completely new level of detail. And later in the series, we'll reveal how Tilly's camera work is helping NASA with state-of-the-art aircraft design. But right now, not everyone is impressed. Large birds of prey often get mobbed by smaller, more manoeuvrable flyers like this buzzard. The last thing they want is an eagle in their airspace. And for the first time ever, we can take you right to the heart of an aerial dogfight.
That is an excerpt from a remarkable new series called Animal Camera, which the BBC will be showing the week after next. And it has, in my book, a most welcome honesty about how the pictures are taken. And indeed, the audience these days, it seems to me, is increasingly happy to know the various techniques that we use. We can now glue a camera to a shark and see what happens down in the depths of the ocean. And when it comes to illuminating flight, as we did there are, of course, other ways in which we manipulate the image, in which we manipulate what it is that the human eye can see. And certainly when it comes to flight, one of the things most valuable, of course, is to use high-speed film, which slows down the beat, for example, of a hummingbird's wings, so that you can see exactly how it works. You can also do the other thing. You can reduce your rate of filming to 1 frame a minute, 1 frame an hour, and so speed up the action. And of course, that is a very valuable technique for showing plant growth. It has a problem, though. Because if you're going to set up a time-lapse setup out in the wild, you're at the mercy of the weather and wild animals, all kinds of problems. And if you want that sequence to run for maybe 4 or 5 days, then you really have a problem. In fact, you have such a problem that you can't actually do that sensibly out in the wild. It's much more efficient and perfectly proper to do that in what you might call captivity. So we wanted, for a series on plants, we wanted to show the pollination of the giant Victoria Amazon lily. Well, this would require setting up a tank in which we grew the lily. We would have to watch it underwater as it sent up a shoot. We would need to see it from above as it spread the leaves. But also, we would need to be able to see other wildlife that was going on in the surrounding. In particular, we would need to see the pollinators, which are beetles. So we set up a tank in a cowshed outside Oxford. And Tim Shepherd, the cameraman who did it, was a man of great ingenuity. He had to keep the water fairly warm. That meant there was a lot of evaporation. That meant that you had to continually feed the tank with water to make sure that the level of the water didn't go up and down in your sequence. That meant that with the water coming across, it formed scum of one sort and another, so you had to have a special floating ramp which kept the scum away and which kept ripples away. You also had problems with the lighting, because in the day the light is of one quality, and at night the lights you were using is another quality. And of course, growth goes on during the night and the day. You had to equalize the light in order that it should match. That would mean that you had blinds which came up, which started artificial light during the day, and then during the night you used the same artificial light, so you had continuity and uniformity of lighting. You had to be able to be underwater. Tim also decided he wanted to be able to travel across the top, and he also had to go out to the Amazon to film the plant in the wild, together with the other animals that were concerned, including the pollinators. So that the end product was a sequence in which was shot partly in Oxfordshire, partly in Brazil, partly underwater, partly at night, partly during the day, with some beetle action slowed down, with clouds which had to move in the background at the right sort of speed while we were in Oxfordshire. And you put all that together, and this is what we got. It's for you to decide which was shot where. Access to light is the great problem here. Those plants that can command the surface can rule the lake, and none does so on a greater scale and more aggressively than this, the giant Amazon water lily. Its gigantic leaves are armoured with spines that protect them against any fish that might try to make a meal of them. Their huge expanse is kept outstretched and floating on the surface by a lattice of buoyant, air-filled struts. The crinkles in the surface swiftly flatten out as the leaf expands to its full size. The edges are turned up so that the leaf can shoulder aside any competition. Fully grown, a single leaf is 6 feet across. Virtually no other plants can live in the black shaded water beneath these leaves. They cover the surface so completely, and the support of their air-filled girders is so effective, that birds,
most famously the lily trotter, can spend their entire lives walking around on them, collecting insects. The giant lily's flowers are on an equally monumental scale. They're about a foot across. The life of any one bloom is short. It opens in the evening and gives off a strong perfume. During the night it closes, and it stays closed for the whole of the next day, slowly flushing pink. On its second evening it opens again. Then it closes for the last time. Why does it behave in this extraordinary way? It's a neat way of avoiding any chance of being fertilized by its own pollen. The perfume it produces on its first evening attracts beetles. They bring with them pollen from other lilies, so this flower is about to be fertilized. But then the lily closes its petals. The beetles will be held captive inside for 24 hours. The following evening, the beautiful prison opens its gates and the inmates are free to go. The flower has showered the beetles with its own pollen during their long stay. Now red and odourless, the flower is no longer attractive to beetles, so they'll go in search of white flowers on another plant, carrying the pollen and bringing about cross-fertilization. Its mission completed, the flower withdraws back to its watery world.
Well, that sequence, of course, is full of deception. But I have no inhibition either about showing it or confessing to it, because it does seem to me that it summarizes this quite complex pollination process pretty well and gives you an image of an important happening in that plant's life. So I have no difficulty about not confessing that parts of that were shot in a tank in Oxfordshire. Now, of course, we have new equipment which enables us to go to the most extraordinary places, places that I wouldn't have believed possible that we could have ever filmed in 20, 30 years ago, and which only recently have we managed to master the technology that enables us to do so. We borrow equipment from all branches of the scientific community. One of the most valuable is the one that we borrowed from medicine, the endoscopes, the fiber optic probes, which enabled us to go not simply down somebody's gullet into his stomach, but into all kinds of animal habitations to see what goes on there. Not only that, but we also are able to use infrared lighting and infrared cameras to see in what is in effect darkness as far as we're concerned and as far as the animal is concerned, largely as far as we can tell. That produces some quite extraordinary images. Here, for example, is one.
Exactly what went on inside the lodge during winter, so when the beavers were away, we installed a couple of infrared cameras in order to find out. A branch from the fridge is being brought back to the lodge for the whole family to feed on. And another. No wonder they don't need to hibernate with this ingenious setup. The lodge is warm and safe even in midwinter, and the only sign of activity in the snug home beneath the snow is hot air rising from the vent at the top. Inside, our cameras catch a glimpse of what, at first sight, looks like a very small beaver. It's a muskrat. There are a pair of them in here. This is a new observation. Do the beavers actually know in the pitch blackness that there are strangers among them? We noticed that the muskrats regularly left the lodge to forage under the ice. And on several occasions they returned a few minutes later with a load of fresh reeds. Perhaps the muskrats are paying rent by regularly providing fresh bedding for the lodge. Maybe that is why the beavers accept them and even allow them to share their food. Our infrared lights, however, are no longer welcome, it seems.
So maybe beavers can see infrared lights. But infrared filming is one of the great advances over the past few years, as far as I'm concerned, particularly when it comes to filming with mammals, because most mammals are most active at night. And we haven't been able to see what they've been doing until the introduction of this technology. And it is quite extraordinary technology. An infrared camera, an infrared light the size of my little finger, could illuminate the whole of this room. In fact, we would probably use two so that you can get two extreme shadows. And that has produced all kinds of information about what happens particularly in the African night. It's not the only advance. The most recent advance of filming in the dark, or what is in effect dark as far as we are concerned and as far as the animals are concerned, are the thermal cameras. Cameras which use the energy of the animal's warm blood to create an image. It only works, of course, with warm-blooded creatures, mammals and birds, but the results with the latest of thermal cameras are quite extraordinary. It's no longer a question of just getting a generalized glow, which changes in color according to, if it's blue, it's cold, and it goes up through orange to red when it's very hot. It's no longer a question of that. Now you can use thermal imaging cameras to define even the veins in the wing of a bat, as you'll see.
Outside, it's 20 degrees below freezing. Inside, icicles hang from the ceiling. And yet, these little brown bats can survive throughout the winter without a single meal. How do they do it? The thermal imaging camera is showing my face as red and orange. That's because it's warm. I'm a mammal. Putting it more precisely, I'm losing energy as heat. But these little bats are blue because they are cold as the rock to which they're clinging. As the bats are no longer losing any heat to their surroundings, they're using hardly any energy at all, and their metabolism has slowed down almost to a stop. They're in the deepest hibernation. They have to wake up then to have a drink. And as they fire up their body chemistry, so their image on the glows like a furnace. Once awake, a male seeks out the slumbering females. He won't get a warm reception to his advances, but he won't meet with much resistance either. He will mate with several more, and then, after a drink, he will return to sleep until the spring.
So now we have close to total imaging versatility. We can take our cameras up in the eye, up in the sky on the back of a bird, down to the bottom of the sea on the back of a shark. We can film in the dark, we can speed things up, we can slow things down. We have the ability to go almost anywhere and get pictures. But of course, that does lead to another problem. It's all very well having all the equipment to record something. How can you help or persuade or succeed in getting the animals that you're interested in to do what it is you want them to do? For example, well, of course, that's a fairly simple way, a simple problem, because all you have to do is to make sure that the kingfisher is fed regularly in the right place, so that it comes every day to collect its food from the right place. You are then able to set up some kind of container with a mirror at the bottom of a glass bottom and a camera pointing it in that way, perhaps with a distant switch so that you can operate it from a distance, and you can get shots like that. The bird, of course, was totally wild. But you have to do this sort of thing, this setup, this training, with some degree of care. Because you may think you know what it is that the animal, your animal subject, is supposed to be doing, because you've read the books. Has the animal read the books? Does it know what is expected of it? And if you don't manage to get that shots of doing what you know or suppose the animal is going to do, are you justified in so manipulating things that they appear to do what you expected them to do? That way, of course, lies danger. There is one notorious example from some time back now. Disney set out to make films about the Arctic. This is at a time when the cinemas took natural history documentaries. And one of the famous things producers came across was, of course, the lemmings. That lemmings migrate in certain seasons. They reproduce in huge numbers, so that the tundra is alive with carpets of lemmings, which then solve their ecological problems by deliberately swimming out to sea and committing suicide. That was the story. Unfortunately, Disney's producers couldn't find that happening. So they went to the Arctic, to the Canadian Arctic, and paid Inuit children to collect live lemmings, and they got several dozen. And they took these live lemmings, and they took them to the bank of a river, and they put cameras below the bank, and then they chivied the lemmings so that they tumbled over the bank and fell into the water. And they manipulated things, the images, to produce a very convincing image of the suicide of lemmings. There are two things wrong with it. First of all, The lemmings they used were a North American species and not a Scandinavian species, which is where the myth comes from. And secondly, lemmings don't behave like that. What happens is that you do get big surges in population. You do get a lot of lemmings. They try and find food, and if they come to the bank of a river, they will swim across the river hoping to find more food on the other side. And hence this myth that lemmings deliberately commit suicide. And that myth is so potent that people will now tell you it as a fact because they even now remember that sequence. So if you are going to start down that road, you have to be very careful indeed. And there's a further problem which faces us as natural history filmmakers. Now that we have this extraordinary ability to create images, collect images from the natural world, we can now manipulate them in a way which was impossible up to 10 years ago. We can do so electronically. We can, for example, combine electronic images so that if we want, you can have your bold, brave narrator cutting his way through the jungle, come face to face and be seen together with a ferocious animal which strangely doesn't bother to eat him. And you do that by combining two images, and there is no way in which neither you nor I could tell, in some instances, if it's done skillfully enough, that that was the case. It hasn't happened yet, as far as I know, but that's only as far as I know. You can do other things, too. That splendid series, Walking with Dinosaurs, made it clear that computer imaging now allows you to bring animals that have been extinct for 50 million years back into convincing appearance. And if you can do that, then of course the possibilities don't extend simply to fossil animals. If the animals that you see are failing to behave in the way that you think they should behave, then of course you can make them do so. This is a real problem. It's a problem for us as filmmakers. We must have a code which we stick to, because in the era of which you could make any images at all, our veracity, our morality is crucial. Our reputation is crucial. Of course, it's no greater than that borne by newspapers. They can write things too. So can Alfred Russel Wallace come to that. So you have to judge what you see on the television screen with the same degree of questioning as you would any other source of information. The story that the camera cannot lie is, of course, 100% wrong. The camera is the most convincing liar we have. I started with pictures of a bird of paradise. Let me end with a picture of a bird of paradise, not Paradisia apoda, which was the one which Wallace illustrated, which is now a very well-known species, but with a species which Wallace only saw dead specimens of. Indeed, in the Malay archipelago, he says this particular species, we know nothing whatsoever about it. And that was the case as far as its courtship display was concerned until very recently. It's the six-wired bird of paradise, the Parotia. It lives in a very remote part of New Guinea. And more recently, much more recently than the Paradisia I started with, I went to New Guinea to try and complete a survey of the families of the members of the Bird of Paradise family. And I'd like now just to introduce you to that parrotia.
This is his display ground. Here too the forest floor has been cleared and the saplings stripped of their leaves. He's dressed entirely in black, except for that white disc on his forehead, though there is an iridescent patch on his chest that he can reveal when he wants to, and he does have those 6 black pennants on his head. But he dazzles his mates not so much with his costume as with his choreography. And that being so, he is particularly keen on clearing his stage of anything that might trip up a dancer. Now he's miming, going through the motions of clearing away leaves, even though there aren't any. The stage is now absolutely immaculate. And here's another of those juveniles who come to the arenas of their elders and betters to practice. Amazing, but how sad that none of the girls are here to watch. The master is back. And the audience is assembling. He is going to show how it should be done. First, the warm-up, ritualized across a little more mimed leaf clearing, mounting excitement in the dress circle. And now the performance begins.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is what it does. It's one of the wonders of the world. How sad it would be if we, as natural history filmmakers, became so intoxicated with our skill at manipulating images that eventually people would not actually believe wonders like that. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes or so for questions, and David will take them, standing squarely for the webcam.
Sir.
How often have you, in filming these wonderful images, have come across an event that you painstakingly set up only to have something happen which was both unexpected but also incredibly useful for, say, some other sort of program? So, for example, a predator interrupts that wonderful dance and thus begets a bit of film that can be used some other place.
Well, that certainly happens, and of course, one should take advantage of it. An example was the golden eagle and the buzzard. They didn't expect the golden eagle to be mobbed by the buzzard, but they did, and so you got a remarkable second layer, as it were, to the experience. And it does indeed happen. Sometimes it happens, of course, that that whatever it is you're filming does exactly the opposite of what you expected it to do. We were filming lions in the Serengeti, and we went to a big pride, and I wanted to demonstrate that the big lion, male lion roar, would cause the pride to become very aggressive. So we found the pride, and we very carefully and very safely, I hasten to add, in case, you know, we put the speaker up in a thorn tree. And I said to the recordist who put it up, don't worry, if one of the members of the pride goes for it, you know, don't worry that it's BBC property. It'll be all right. We'll pay for it. And the scientist who was helping us drove away in another Land Rover. And so in due course, we got the speaker, we put on the recording of the lion roar. And they all went, whoa. Nothing happened with the lionesses. The pride took no notice whatsoever. So we increased the volume. And the lioness, no notice whatsoever. We did it a third time, and the entire pride got up and walked lazily away. And I went to the lion scientist who had advised us, and I was about to say, what about... And he said, wasn't that fantastic? And I said, nothing happened. He said, precisely. We didn't show that sequence. So,
what events or species would you still like to film?
We have been shamefully neglectful of the world of small creatures, particularly terrestrial invertebrates. The first animals that ever came up onto the land 450 million years ago, the very basis of all our ecosystems. And the reason we have been that way is not only because people don't think, though they're wrong, don't think that they're interested in spiders. It's because we haven't had the right sort of gear. And I didn't mention it in my catalogue of our technological equipment, but now we have remarkable gear. A tiny little camera with a lens the size of a match head, which you can put upon apparatus which will track alongside looking up at a spider. We have lights. I mean, before, if you wanted to film small creatures and get any depth of focus, you had to put so much light on them that you fried them. Now we have got cold light, and we can do that. And I'm at the moment working with my colleagues in the Natural History Unit on a new series about terrestrial invertebrates.
Since you are interested in deception and honesty, could I beg you and all similar filmmakers, when you speed things up and slow things down, put an indicator on the screen, because it's very often not possible to tell, unless you're an expert, that it is being speeded up or slowed down. And I do think that is a major source of misleading people.
I agree. Whether we should put it on every time we do it, I don't know. What you're going to do with macro photography, of course, when ants are scurrying across the place, Well, you clearly have to change the scale. If you're going into their world, you're going to have to change your time scale, are you not? Otherwise, it appears them to be running much faster than in fact they are. And we have, I think, perhaps been guilty, particularly in bird flight. Producers have felt that realistic bird flight, accurate time of bird flight, is so swift that you can't really see the motion of the wings, and have regularly, in the past, have reduced that rate by slightly overcranking the film. But I accept your point. One over there.
So David, could you tell me what sort of feedback you've had from the public, for example, to that impressive scene when the killer whales were playing around with the seal? Do you get people saying that this is murder? Do they equate predation with murder?
The question of showing animal cruelty, if I may use the word cruelty in this context, is one that exercises us a great deal. It's not only killer whales. Lion kills. We have to strike, it seems to me, a very careful balance. On the one hand, there are people who are anxious that we should never show any kind of violence whatsoever in the natural world. There is no way in which you can show the life history of a lion without showing a kill. We are not in the business of telling fairy stories. And the distortions which you put into your film, if you were to omit all that, would be totally unacceptable to me. On the other hand, if we showed the full reality of a lion kill, of the guts being ripped out, of the animal being eaten alive, which happens if you see it, it happens. We don't show that either. So we have to somehow show the reality of life and death in the natural world, and yet at the same time not dwell upon the most excessive part of it. That seems to be the only thing we can possibly do. Surprisingly, you may think, and perhaps I think too, you have audiences of 5 million people who will see a killer whale sequence. And the number of letters that write and say that we shouldn't have shown it are truthfully to be numbered on one hand. It is not large. I think people really do believe the sincerity of the filmmaker in his attempt to show what goes on. Madam.
Thank you. You've talked a lot about truth and falsehood and how we judge it and so on. I'm quite interested that all the places where we laugh in the films that you show are places where the story you tell is actually a fiction. That is to say, you tell a very anthropomorphized. I mean, we laugh because you tell an anthropomorphized story about courtship or and so on. Have you changed that at all since the early days? I mean, I know it's your trademark, but do you ever worry about that? Do you ever worry about the extent to which we've all grown up believing that polar bears romp with their children just like we romp with our own children?
Well, oddly enough, judging by this audience, you laughed at things that I didn't heighten in any way. The biggest laugh, and I know it, I expected it, the biggest laugh was that extraordinary climax to the Faraday Bird of Paradise. The commentary was minimal. And in fact, to anthropomorphize to the extent of saying the ladies have assembled in the front row of the dress circle is, in my book, a perfectly accurate way of representing Bird of Paradise courtship dances. That's what happens.
Apart from faithfully representing this extraordinary, wonderful behaviour, are there any differences which you hope your programmes will make to the way individuals and societies of humans behave?
We are an increasingly urbanized society. A great number of us, and I include myself in this, a great number of us do not see a single wild creature from day to day to day, except perhaps a domesticated pigeon. And that is a huge deprivation personally to us. But it is more than that. If we grow up in ignorance of the realities of the natural world, we cannot take the decisions which we need to take and give democratic support to the decisions that need to be taken about the conservation of this world in which we live. And I do certainly on occasion do programs in which I beat the conservation drum. But I think to do so on every occasion would be a mistake. People will not value things they don't know about or understand. It's unreasonable to ask them that they should. If we are to be serious about ecological preservation, that actually has a cost that people have to be asked to make. It is a deprivation to stop fishing. It is a deprivation to do certain things in farming. If people wish that to be done, they will only do so because they value the natural world. And sadly, television now is one of the few channels that are left which are able to keep people in contact. There's one right at the back.
Hello. Just sticking to the conservation tone, I'm coming back to the idea of deception and wondering whether there are any cases where you feel it is right to deceive. Let's say perhaps there's a particularly rare species that you'd like to have on camera, but it only exists in captivity. You want the audience to know that it exists, and so, you know, is it right to set up a situation where it's filmed in the wild?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, my answer would be that we have an obligation to show these sort of things. I don't think, we perhaps deceive to the extent that we lead people to suppose that an animal is more easy to see than in fact it is, or indeed more abundant than it in fact is. But I don't, unless if I have your point correctly, I don't think we are culpable on that score.
Given the kind of equipment you have as a group filming things, you're probably discovering things and have a budget to do so more than some scientists have. How much do you share the kind of stuff you do with working scientists? How much do they come to you before just sitting with the family watching it on television and say, you with your endoscopic camera are probably finding out stuff we need to know for our research?
Nearly always we consult the scientist who is an expert on that particular species we're hoping to work with. And these days, almost every big mammal actually has a particular scientist who knows more about it than anybody else. So we would be very foolish if we decided to barge in without consulting them. And usually, very often, they have students in the field or come into the field themselves. And so we plan very closely together what it is we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And part of the deal is that we should give them everything that we record. It often seems to me that when you go into the field and you meet somebody who has been sitting there in the middle of the West African forest for 15 years, day after day after day after day, following the same group of monkeys or whatever. And that suddenly, out of the blue, a television crew turned up and they say, well, will you kindly take us to what it is you took 15 years to discover, because we would like to film it tomorrow. I wouldn't be in a bit surprised if such scientists said, well, jump in the lake. Why should I tell you? I have to say that that's never, ever happened. And usually, the scientist concerned, provided he is convinced that you will show it as honestly as you can, is only too delighted that somebody else is coming to look at the creature that's obsessed him for 15 years.
What I actually meant more, in a way, was that he may have been watching these monkeys for 15 years, but you, with some special equipment, may show him something. Of course, he's the expert, and I understand that you would go to him first, and he will tell you mountains of stuff, but you might produce something that he's never seen before, like a platypus giving birth or something, that he's never, ever seen before in his life. So the exchange must be pretty good, really, from everybody's point of view.
That, indeed, I suppose I was being over-modest, I should have said. It happens quite frequently. This is an addendum to my previous answer. That it does happen, again, that the scientists will look at the film and say, I've never seen that in 15 years. The last time I remember was looking at some rushes on Blue Planet, and there were auks that were swimming with their wings at a depth of 20, 30 feet. And he looked at it and said, I've never ever seen that. And actually, he had no opportunity to see it. How could he? So it is certainly a partnership in which we are much in the debt of the scientists. We wouldn't make the films without scientists. And if we can pay something back, I assure you, we take every opportunity to do so, really.
And I'm very, very reluctant to draw it to a close, but unfortunately we have something else on in the hall later. It doesn't affect you out there in the webcast, so we're going to have to draw it to a close at this point, and I do it with no pleasure. My briefing notes say I was to give a vote of thanks, but we absorbed that in the question time virtually, and what I would ask in just an instant is that we again express our appreciation, and the web audience that have been hugely welcome, and I hope you've enjoyed as much as the people here evidently have, can fade out on a wave of applause, and then after a decent interval I will make some housekeeping announcements. But it remains only...